A freight train can roll out of Warsaw on time, cross green fields, pass quiet towns, and still lose hours for a reason most people never see. It's not the weather, it's not traffic, it's not even the length of the trip. It's a hidden mismatch that turns nearby into not yet. That mismatch is why the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania can feel like they're on a different clock from the rest of Europe. Not a clock on a wall, a logistics clock, the kind that decides whether a container arrives in hours or in days. And here's the twist. The clock can be as small as 85 millimeters. That's the difference between the 1920 millimeter track gauge used across much of the Baltic region's legacy network and 1435 millimeter standard gauge used across most of the European Union's main rail routes. Same continent, two track widths, two systems of time. When that mismatch shows up at a border or a junction, trains don't just glide through. Cargo may need to be shifted, wagons may need special handling, schedules can slip, and planning gets harder. The result is simple. The Baltics can be physically close to Central Europe, but operationally farther away than they should be. Now the Baltics are building a new rail spine to change that, north to south, linking into Poland and onward toward the wider European network. This is Rail Baltica, and it's designed to do something surprisingly dramatic, put the region on the same rail time zone as the rest of Europe. But don't think this is just about faster passenger rides. The bigger story is timing, of supply chains, of ports, and in today's security environment, even of defense movement planning. And the closer you look, the more you realize the real battle is against friction, technical friction, border friction, and calendar friction. Rail isn't only steel on stone, it's standard, and standards are how railways tell time. If two countries share the same standards, trains can flow like water. If they don't, every border becomes a valve you have to open slowly. In Lithuania, the European Commission notes that two gauges coexist, broad gauge and standard gauge for the Rail Baltica section. That single sentence tells you the whole challenge. The region is trying to connect two rail worlds without breaking service in the middle. Gauge is the most famous mismatch, but it's not the only one. Electrification systems can differ, signaling rules can differ, even the way rail authorities talk to trains can differ. When those systems don't match, you can't run rail like a smooth cross-border conveyor belt. That's why Rail Baltica is described as not a normal upgrade. It's more like a new backbone, built to European standards, so trains can move north-south without constantly switching how they operate. And here's where the title becomes real. A different clock doesn't mean the Baltics are behind. It means the system they inherited was built for a different network, so the timing rules were never fully aligned with the West. Rail Baltica is an attempt to rewrite the timing rules. Rail Baltica is planned as a roughly 900-kilometer railway line built to 1435 millimeter standard gauge, designed for 249 km/h passenger trains and 120 km/h freight trains. Those numbers matter because they define what kind of service the line is built to handle: fast, frequent passenger service and serious freight capacity. It's also planned to be electrified, which means trains draw power from overhead lines instead of carrying diesel fuel. Rail Baltica describes the system as 2 × 25 kilovolts. You don't need to memorize that, but you should hear what it implies. This is a modern, high-capacity power setup meant for a high-performance corridor. Then there's signaling, how trains stay safely separated at speed. Rail Baltica lists ERTMS Level 2 for traffic management. In simple terms, ERTMS is a shared European language for train control, designed to help trains move across borders without needing a totally different control system each time. And here's a key detail that affects everything. Rail Baltica states single track in Phase 1 with double track in full project scope. That's not just engineering trivia, that's a story about time and money. How you build something big enough to matter, even when the full, perfect version is still out of reach. So the project isn't only build a line, it's build a line that can grow. A first version that works, then a stronger version later if funding and schedules allow. That's the practical compromise behind many megaprojects. If you're a commuter, you care about stations and schedules. If you're a logistics planner, you care about something else: reliability. Can you plan a route that behaves the same way every week, or does it break at a border because of mismatched systems? Rail Baltica is built around the idea of a through corridor, a north-south route that can connect into Poland and onward into the wider European rail network, instead of forcing the Baltics to rely mainly on legacy routes that weren't designed for seamless westward flow. And freight is where the different clock shows up the most. A factory doesn't just need a train, it needs a chain. Factory to terminal to rail corridor to port to ship, or the reverse. When rail standards align, that chain can tighten. When they don't, it stretches, and stretched chains cost money. Rail Baltica's technical targets hint at its freight ambition. It lists a 25-ton axle weight, which is a way of saying the line is built for heavy-duty freight, not just light passenger trains. It also points to modern corridor thinking, long trains, modern control systems, and electrification that supports consistent performance. This isn't a small local line, it's a spine intended to carry serious weight, both literally and economically. Now we step carefully into a sensitive but real reason this corridor gets so much attention: security planning. When officials talk about military mobility, they're talking about moving troops and equipment quickly across Europe by road, rail, sea, and air without getting stuck in paperwork or weak infrastructure. The European Commission's November 19, 2025 update describes a push toward a military Schengen, including harmonized rules and a maximum 3-day processing time for cross-border military movement requests, plus streamlined customs formalities. That's not a slogan, it's an attempt to make time predictable in an emergency. The Action Plan on Military Mobility 2.0 is blunt about the problem. National rules can be fragmented, infrastructure can be unprepared for dual-use needs, and key transport capabilities can be scarce. In plain words, even if you have the equipment, you may not have the smooth pathway to move it fast. This is where Rail Baltica becomes more than a passenger project. A modern, standard-gauge, electrified corridor with unified signaling reduces one huge category of delay. The system doesn't match. It won't solve every problem, but it removes a major kind of friction from the map. And notice how the story loops back to the tiny number again, 85 millimeters. In normal life, 85 millimeters is nothing. In rail logistics, it can be the difference between direct movement and complicated workarounds. That's why gauges show up in military logistics discussions too. If you want a rail line to keep time, you start with geometry, track alignment, curves, gradients, and the physical space around the railway. That's the slow, heavy work, earthworks, bridges, drainage, because steel can only be as smooth as the ground beneath it. Then come the wires. On September 15, 2025, Rail Baltica marked the signing of an electrification contract valued at 1.77 billion euros, excluding VAT, awarded to the Kobalek Rail Baltica Consortium. This matters because electrification is not a nice-to-have on a modern corridor. It's the power system that makes high performance possible. Rail Baltica's own reporting ties that electrification effort to the phased plan, with a first phase scheduled toward 2030. That's a reminder that megaprojects don't move in straight lines, they move in funded slices. Now add the language layer, signaling and control. Rail Baltica's general requirements state the line's signaling will be based on ERTMS Level 2, baseline at least 3, and that trains without ERTMS on board are not allowed on the line. That's strict by design, because the whole point is interoperability without guesswork. So when people ask, why is this so expensive? Part of the answer is, you're not paying only for rails. You're paying for a unified system. Track, power, control, safety rules built to match the wider European network. That's what turns a local railway into a corridor. And that unified system is what changes the clock. Not because trains magically go faster everywhere, but because the route becomes simpler to operate, simpler to schedule, and simpler to scale. The time you save isn't just speed, it's fewer forced slowdowns. There's a common misconception. If countries are close partners, trains should cross easily. In reality, rail borders can stay complicated even when road travel feels simple. Railways are tightly controlled systems. If standards don't match, the border becomes a technical checkpoint. That's why the Baltic's different clock is mostly about predictability. Businesses and governments don't just want movement, they want dependable movement. They want to know that next month won't suddenly require a new workaround.
Rail Baltica's promise is that once the corridor runs on consistent European standards, the technical border shrinks. You still have rules, you still have safety, but you remove one of the biggest causes of rail time loss: incompatibility. And that matters for daily life too, because when freight flows better, shelves restock more smoothly. When the region feels less far away in logistics terms, investment decisions can change. A clock shift is not a metaphor to the people pricing transport contracts. Every megaproject has a moment when the dream hits the spreadsheet. For Rail Baltica, that moment is public and well documented. Estonia's National Audit Office summarizes that estimated costs rose dramatically, citing an increase from 5.8 billion euros in 2017 to 23.8 billion euros in a draft cost-benefit analysis in 2023. At the EU level, the European Court of Accountants has also tracked Rail Baltica's schedule and cost risk as part of its work on large TEN-T projects, warning that big projects often face delays and financing uncertainty. To cope, the Baltic states have discussed phased delivery. The Estonian audit review describes a two-phase approach where the first phase targets operation around 2030 with reduced scope in some areas, and later phases follow without a firm schedule. That is the reality of building under pressure. You build what you can fund, then you expand. In July 2025, the European Commission adopted milestones for Rail Baltica's completion, an attempt to turn ambition into a managed plan. And in EU law, that kind of milestone setting is more than symbolic. It's how projects stay anchored when timelines start drifting. But even with milestones, the finish line moves if funding and construction realities don't align. That's why you keep hearing the same phrase from auditors and planners: predictable financing. Railways don't like uncertainty. They're built to run on schedules. And notice how this connects back to the clock. Rail Baltica isn't only fighting technical mismatches, it's fighting calendar time, inflation time, procurement time, political decision time, construction season time. A corridor can be technically perfect on paper and still arrive late to reality. So what does it mean to put the Baltics on a different clock? It means the region stops being a special case that needs special handling. The same gauge, the same electrification approach, the same train controls language. That's how you make movement normal. It also means the north-south direction becomes stronger. For a long time, Baltic rail geography was shaped by older routes and older connections. Rail Baltica is a bet that the future map should be more integrated with the EU's main corridors, and that the fastest way to do it is to build the standards into the ground. And yes, there's a security angle. The EU's push toward a military mobility framework is about reducing delay and uncertainty in cross-border movement when time matters most. A corridor like Rail Baltica doesn't create security by itself, but it can reduce one kind of vulnerability: slow movement caused by incompatible systems. If the project succeeds, the biggest change won't be one record-breaking speed run. The biggest change will be boring in the best way. Fewer forced stops, fewer awkward handoffs, fewer "this works here but not there" problems. That's what it looks like when a region joins the same clock. And the final payoff is this: the Baltics don't need a new clock because they were late. They need a new clock because the world changed, supply chains changed, standards changed, and security assumptions changed. Rail Baltica is the physical act of catching up to that new reality, 1 kilometer of track at a time.